If you can't see the problem, I don't know what to tell you. And I stopped mid-gym session and I was like, oh my God, like, oh my God, I've been completely blind to this, but it all makes sense. Understanding inflation and the fact that it's not going to stop. It's just going to continue, and we really have to find a way to preserve our purchasing power. Inflation is just going to get worse. In 70 years, if I put 20 grand in a bank account, it's going to be in the negatives in 70 years. And even thinking about it 10 years time from now is very, very worrying. Banks literally can just press a button to create more money. When you go to the bank for a home loan, they're going to lend you, $800,000, depending on what home you want to buy. That $800,000 has come out of thin air and has now entered the money market and diluted everyone else's dollar that they hold in their pocket.
And that is, for me, one of my biggest concerns for our generation. Welcome back to another episode. Today we're joined by Elle, who is a Gen Z freedom fighter in Australia. Elle, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast, firstly. I am fantastic. About me, my work in the Bitcoin space mostly is around content creation that focuses on Bitcoin education and then just general political, social commentary. I also have started Women in Bitcoin Sydney. So I lead these events where I basically introduce Bitcoin to women in a women's only space. And we're able to chat about what Bitcoin means to women and the best ways to get involved, because obviously women tend to have a bit of a different focus in terms of personal finances. And I think there was a bit of a gap in the market. A lot of the Bitcoin spaces are men, or mostly men at least. And this is fantastic, but it can deter some women from entering these spaces, especially women who don't come from a background of traditional finance. So that's been my focus right now, producing content about Bitcoin and educating women in Sydney about Bitcoin. But about me, I am a fellow Gen Z baby. I'm also a university student, which really ties into the critiques that I dish out with my content that I publish on X and TikTok. And it's given me a sort of unique insight into what the stories that Gen Z are being told and the narrative that is being pushed through higher education, and how Bitcoin kind of flips that completely on its head. And also, I'm able to see from both sides, the Bitcoin side, where we focus very strongly on freedom and Austrian economics, and then the university side or the mainstream side, where these really collectivist principles are peddled. I mean, if you've read my X, you will see how much I've been venting about my experience at university. I've had to read the Communist Manifesto 1,000,001 times. And as I say, it's great to see the other side, because I personally don't agree with everything that's written in the Communist Manifesto or everything that Karl Marx stood for. It's great to read the other side and engage in that alternative content. Unfortunately, what I have seen in my experience at university is that this is the only sort of content that we are being fed, and discussion around it or dissenting opinions is quite readily shut down. So I'm really excited to be on this podcast. Obviously, that brings Bitcoin to Gen Z and how we can navigate the struggles that we're facing as young people, and move toward Bitcoin as a solution to this, rather than these more state-centric solutions that are being offered by mainstream media and university.
That's amazing, the community that you're building up in Sydney. And there's not enough voices in the Bitcoin space, but there's definitely not enough female voices in the Bitcoin space. So that's amazing. And we'll definitely dive into that later on in the episode, as well as what we'll dive into is the uni narrative, because I think that's a really interesting piece. And I always say, everything you know about money is wrong, because if it was right, you'd already be where you want to be financially. And there's always a lot of pushback on these different views when you're talking about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. And it's shut down, in my opinion, because, like you said, the news and the education that's pushed out is propaganda, and it's how individuals want you to see and think about the world, when, as we both know, there's different sides to the story that could potentially lead you to that freedom and to a better life. So we'll dive into that as well. But where I really like to start each podcast episode is, where did you find and feel something was wrong that led you to starting looking for different answers?
So for me, the answer to this is twofold. One, when I was around 18, 19, I had some money and I needed to put it somewhere. I was considering purchasing property. But I really, for some background, I had no experience handling my personal finances beyond saving. I've always been a very, very good saver, but beyond that, I had very little practical experience. So when I decided, my money is sitting in, I think it was in a term deposit at that time, that yields what, 4%, I believe is what I was getting. And then I was seeing grocery prices go up. I was seeing the difficulty with the rental situation in Sydney, which is another story. I was just seeing all the prices go up around me, and I had money that I wanted to protect. So I was considering going into the property market, and I was doing my research around around purchasing property. And I really wasn't liking what I was seeing in terms of, well, one, the choice. I mean, me as a 19-year-old, my borrowing capacity is very small. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to invest in property beyond just living there, but actually using it as a tool of investment and renting it out, because I'm not the biggest fan of using property as an investment if there are other options. I would like to keep housing just as housing. I think that's how it's supposed to be. I don't blame people for investing in property, as I've said with my friends who are thinking about it. Obviously, it can be a decent option. That's why we are told to invest in property. But for me, morally, it just doesn't sit right where there are other options. And around this time, I met my ex-boyfriend, who was a real big Bitcoiner. And after a couple months of passively listening, something piqued my interest. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I begun to do my own research. And then I really, really fell down the rabbit hole. And I think within about 6 months, I became what we would call a Bitcoiner, or a Bitcoin maxi even. But I think that was kind of preceded by my already changing political outlook. I was always I always held somewhat conservative views on social topics, but then I was also quite liberal on other things and believed in wealth distribution to a certain extent, but then I really criticized it on the other hand. So at this point, when I was around 19, I was really starting to sift out these ideas, and I was beginning to look into libertarianism, and I was beginning to read quite a lot of literature written by libertarians, and starting to conceptualize the world from that lens. And so with that background, and with my need to put my money somewhere, and with finally finding out what Bitcoin was, all of this amalgamated into how I now am able to see the world. And so I think that was the real turning point. It was a mixture of different things, and it kind of all fell together at the perfect time, really. I think given my interest in libertarianism, I would like to think I would have come across Bitcoin at some point. But I think because I was introduced to it by my partner at the time, it just happened a whole lot quicker. And yeah, so I went from thinking about investing in property to all of a sudden being like, oh my God, like I see the problem here. It's not just that Woolies is choosing to put up bread prices from $3 to $6 over the course of a year, but there is a much deeper, much more systemic problem here. And that's what opened my eyes to it. So I think it was probably in the span of about 3 to 6 months that I was able to go from someone who knew literally nothing about economics, very little about personal finance, again, beyond saving, to someone who was just totally orange-pilled and against central banks and critical of government. So it was quite a fast process for me, but I mean, I'm so grateful for this journey, and every single day I learn something new, but that's really where it started. And I've just built upon that, really.
Yeah, and it can be a quick journey to start getting orange pilled and understanding Bitcoin if you know where to look. And that's really the goal for this podcast, is to be a source of information for Gen Z that that want to go down that rabbit hole and ultimately see a better future for themselves. Just at the end there, you were talking about the problem and that it just all clicked for you. Do you remember what that moment was that clicked? And in basic terms, what is the problem that we're facing?
Well, essentially, the problem that there are multiple problems that we're facing. I do remember the moment that it clicked, but not so much just on the monetary side of it. For me, I more approached Bitcoin from like a critical social lens or a political lens rather than just focusing on, money go up. But yes, for me, I do remember I was in the gym one day and I had been listening to the What is Money podcast with Robert Breedlove. And it was one of his series. They were talking about social contracts, what that means, libertarianism, free markets. And earlier that day, I had actually had a debate, an argument, if you will, with my university professor when we were talking about state wealth redistribution. And I don't know what it was about this podcast, what they were saying, but I think probably the fact I had had this argument earlier in the day, I was still hung up on it. And then suddenly everything just fell into place. And Robert Breedlove is a fantastic podcast host. I feel like he explains these ideas really well and he guides his guests to narrate them in a very digestible way. But something about this just blew my mind. And I stopped mid-gym session and I was like, oh my God. Like, oh my God, I've been completely blind to this, but it all makes sense. Like every grievance that I had had prior to this that I couldn't work out in my mind, that I couldn't justify, all started to fall together like pieces of a puzzle. And that really, really shook me. But that's sort of how I approached Bitcoin. And then learning about like the numbers side of it, the money side of it, really came somewhat secondary for me. But obviously, it is important. And why I first did look into Bitcoin was, like I said, I was looking for somewhere to put my money that would outpace inflation and that would hopefully outpace the housing market or the property market in Australia. So the numbers spoke to me and obviously they looked very good. But yeah, I think approaching it from that angle allowed me to tease out some of the questions I had on a more macro lens before I really got into the sticks of Bitcoin. But as for your question, what is the problem? Like I said, I think there are many problems, but one of the problems I think Bitcoin aims to solve is one of the most pressing financial problems, which is inflation. And by inflation, what I make sure to make a distinction of is I don't mean inflation because you want butter and cows don't have enough food, so there are only a few cows to produce this butter and thus the butter price goes up. I don't mean that type of inflation. I mean the type of inflation that is created when banks, quote unquote, print money, new money to enter the system and thus dilute everyone else's purchasing power. And I think Bitcoin quite clearly seeks to offer an alternative to this with its capped supply of 21 million. But I think that is probably the best way to sort of get your foot in the door when you're trying to educate people on why Bitcoin is necessary, because everyone feels inflation. Even if you don't live out of home, I know a lot of like Gen Zers who still live at home because they feel they actually cannot afford to live outside of home, and it's only getting worse year on year. Everyone notices it. So being able to explain that this is the problem, it's only getting worse, it's going to continue to get worse, and like a snowball, it's going to get faster and faster. Instilling that sense of urgency into someone when they're looking for alternatives of where they want to put their money outside of just saving in a bank account is really important. And so that's where I started, beyond just the political side of it, understanding inflation and the fact that it's not going to stop. It's just going to continue. And we really have to find a way to preserve our purchasing power in order to get anywhere in life, especially because we are so young and under this idea that inflation is just going to get worse, which I think we can probably agree on. I'm 23. I have 70 years ahead of me that I'm going to be alive for in this system. Like I need somewhere to put my money. In 70 years, if I put 10 grand, 20 grand in a bank account, it's going to be worth it's going to be in the negatives in 70 years. And even thinking about it 10 years time from now is very, very worrying. So yeah, I think inflation is the number one problem that Bitcoin seeks to solve and to offer safe haven from.
So when I speak to people, everyone, like you said, feels inflation, but, and I don't know why I think this because I didn't know until I knew, but when you say money printing, I speak to so many people that don't know what money printing is. So would you be able to explain simply again what money printing is and how that's leading to inflation that people do feel and understand?
Sure. So I'm no economist, so I'm not going to give you like a complete dissection of what money printing is. But from my understanding, the number one way money is printed or new money is added to our system is through the issuance of debt. Banks, because we live in a fiat system, banks literally can just press a button to create more money. So when you go to the bank for a home loan, they're going to lend you, $800,000, depending on what home you want to buy. That $800,000 has come out of thin air and has now entered the money market and diluted everyone else's dollar that they hold in their pocket. Of course, there are other tools of inflation like quantitative easing, and that is literally essentially just pressing a button to print money. That's not like debt issuance in that sense. That's literally just pressing a button. But the number one way new money is added to circulating money is through debt issuance. And in Australia, obviously, with the most sought after investment being housing, this is a very, very big problem. And it also escalates when we consider things like the new 5% home buyers scheme or deposit, however it's called. This only makes things worse. And in turn, it also inflates asset prices. It inflates housing prices as well. So you get new money added to a system, the dollar that's in your pocket gets devalued, and then the thing that you're trying to buy with that dollar also goes up in price. If you can't see the problem, I don't know what to tell you. But whenever I kind of talk to people in this way, they tend to begin to be able to see it. And that's how I've been able to conceptualize it from a non-finance major, non-economics background.
Yeah, and it creates this negative flywheel then where it's, here's your 5% deposit, so now you need a 95% mortgage.
Yeah.
How are we going to give you that money? We're going to print the money. What does that do? That means assets go up. So then the mortgages are getting bigger and bigger. They're printing more and more money, and then it gets out of control. And that is, for me, one of my biggest concerns for our generation, because it's the same in the UK that property and getting on the property ladder is the one thing people are told to do to be successful or safe, quote unquote. That can't go on forever. So my biggest fear for people is they spend all this time working really hard and doing everything right, saving for their deposit. When is it going to get to the point where they buy that house, they feel that success, that they've done it, they've made it, they've got their house, and then prices crash? And then not only have they bought this, they've spent so many years saving this deposit to get the house, to buy an inflated house, to then just see the value of it disappear right in front of them. And it's happened before. I know there's a lot of people that say it will just keep going up and up, and if they do, just keep printing money. But there's going to get to a point like the US is getting to at the moment with the amount of debt in the system that it can't just keep going forever because the interest payments are too much. So that's my biggest fear. You mentioned earlier about initially when you were looking at maybe getting a rental as opposed to, or buying a buy-to-let as opposed to just buying a house for property. Would you mind also touching a bit on the difference between a buy-to-let that could be an asset if it's cash flowing versus saving up and buying a house for residency and a mortgage, which then becomes a liability because it's taking money out of your pocket, so that people can understand those two differences? Because I then think that will help perhaps see where Bitcoin can fit in with this as opposed to just buying a house.
Yeah, of course. So for me, like, I do want to preface, I have completely removed myself from considering purchasing property in Australia anytime soon. I think for me, the only time I will purchase property in Australia is when the time comes and I have a family and children, just for that stability. But even then, I'm still unsure. So when it comes to buying a house to let versus buying a house to live in it, they're two very different things, but I don't have experience doing really either of those things. Some of my friends are beginning to consider buying a house or buying a property to live in. And to me, it just seems like an absolute disaster waiting to happen. So, of course, I'm desperately trying to orange pill them, but at the same time, I'm trying to walk with them to navigate them through what is a completely rigged scheme. If you're going to buy a house to live in, firstly, you're going to have to service that debt. And if you buy a house to live in, of course, you might be able to access this 5% deposit scheme. But that means that you're borrowing 95% of your home's value. And with fluctuating interest rates, you're going to have to adapt, of course. But then we also face the problem as we enter into the modern world, and a world that is becoming more technologically advanced. AI is taking so many people's jobs. We also have, of course, I mean, as we kind of are talking about, the threat of absolute currency collapse as well. It just seems like such a precarious time to take on so much debt in a currency that is inflating every single day. So for me, absolutely not worth it. I do know, and I was at the time also considering purchasing property to then rent it out. And there are concessions that the government in Australia will offer. So things like negative gearing. But then also, I don't believe you can access the 5% home deposit scheme if you're buying to let. You have to weigh it up for yourself. But then you have this asset that, one, you're having to pay down the debt on. Two, you're having to deal with tenants, which I can imagine would not be particularly easy. Three, this is something that is prone to graffiti, natural disaster, a leaky toilet. I personally, and this was something that came into me weighing up property or Bitcoin, I don't want to be on the hook for a leaky toilet at 2 p.m. on a Friday when I can just put my money into Bitcoin and it's going to grow 10 times faster. That's not my preference. Apparently it is some people's. But that weighing of the pros and the cons between Bitcoin or purchasing a property to then let out and hopefully generate cash flow, for me, it just makes so much more sense to buy Bitcoin, especially as someone who is so young. It's not like I'm in a government career that I know is going to always be there, that's going to pay me in line with inflation, and I'm not going to have to worry about losing my job overnight. I'm not in that position, and not many people our age are. So the risk of not being able to pay back my mortgage or keep up with those payments, the risk of my property being damaged and then me having to fork out cash to pay for that, it just seems like such a faff to me when there are other good options. Well, one other good option like Bitcoin. But it all does come down to personal preference. Like, of course, right now, I don't have children, so I am okay with knowing that where I rent at the moment, at the end of next year, my lease might not be renewed. I'm all right with that because I can manage that. If I had 4 kids, that might be a bit different. And so that's when I would really consider purchasing property to live in. It does really come down to personal preference, but I would say the overwhelming majority of our generation would do so much better in more terms than just money, but of course, especially in growth of your capital. So much better just investing in Bitcoin rather than trying to climb the property ladder and contend with boomers who have 12 properties in Vaucluse who are going to outbuy you in the blink of an eye. It's a rigged game, and we are starting so late and on the back foot. But Bitcoin is accessible. You can buy a very small amount. That's another thing. With property, you are buying the entire place. You can't just buy a fraction of a room. With Bitcoin, you only have $1,000, that's fine. You can buy just $1,000 of Bitcoin. Yeah, so it comes down to personal preference, but what I try to tell my friends who are starting to look into purchasing property is there are other options. Property is, obviously, it's not liquid at all, so you have to contend with that issue. Are you really secure in your job? Can you really make those mortgage repayments? And can you pay for, if God forbid the roof caves in on a Tuesday evening? I just don't think that as a whole Gen Z is really in a position to enter the Australian, or especially not the Sydney property market. I think our cash is much better off in Bitcoin.
Yeah, worth saying none of this is financial advice. Obviously, do your own research. But I think that fundamentally is the point that you're making. Buying or property is better than saving your money in a bank account, for sure. But there are better options out there if depending on what goal you want. I think our generation don't weigh up, like they don't math the options in front of them. They just think, I'm going to buy a house because that's what other generations have done and it's worked for them. But it is a completely different game now for our generation. And it was the same with me. I just wanted to buy a house because that's what I was told to do to be successful. With that, I mentioned it a bit at the start where we really do think and believe things based on what we're told from a young age, really. But you touched on you're at uni, you've seen both sides. How do you think, or what's your experience been with this of kind of almost an indoctrination of one side of this is the right way and the avoidance of looking any other direction?
Yeah. So I definitely have been firsthand witness to this for a few years now. I do think it's multifaceted, and I really think it starts with and preys off and actually feeds back into how disillusioned we are as a generation. Because yes, you're right. We have been told from the second we were born, especially in Australia, save for that deposit, buy a house. This is your ticket to freedom or your ticket to wealth. And this no longer the case. Saving for a deposit is, well, one, that term saving for a deposit. I don't think anyone is going to be able to save for a deposit by putting fiat dollars in their bank account in Australia. That's not going to happen. But also the market's completely changed. And this idea of just getting into the property market is not as easy as it once was. Not that it was a walk in the park back in the day, but it was at least accessible for many. Now it's incredibly difficult. And I do think that higher education takes advantage of the fact that they know that this, pathway to freedom or wealth, being the property ladder, is really inaccessible. And they also know how burnt out Gen Z is. Because think about it, we're one of, I think, a few million who really, really know about Bitcoin. This is like in the grand scheme, a very underground movement that's happening at the moment. And so the knowledge of Bitcoin is by no means widespread. And so what a lot of people our age are contending with is either I save in a bank account or a term deposit that yields 4%, or I attempt to get into the property market, which is not going to happen. And that's it. That's really all they have. And then you can look into like traditional finance or stocks, but people don't. They don't really know. And even if they do, it's not at all on the same level as Bitcoin in terms of like capital growth, but also with everything else that Bitcoin offers, security, sovereignty. It's worlds away. But that's what Gen Z is contending with. Inability to access the housing market and a sense of what's the point in saving anyway. And where I think university plays a really big role is piggybacking on those beliefs that there is no point, and instead substituting personal responsibility and pushing oneself to find alternative options like Bitcoin, and to work very hard for that. Substituting that with more collectivist or like redistributivist ideas. So that's exactly like I was saying before, where things like the Communist Manifesto being the number one piece of literature I've had to read during my, I think, 3 or 4 years at university at this point. It's ridiculous. But also you get people who are so disillusioned and also so young and feel like they have no other option. And then you feed them this narrative that the state should have jurisdiction to seize people's wealth and seize people's assets and redistribute them. And two, that this is the only way. And that's the real problem that I have with university and mainstream narratives, because it's also unquestionable. At the beginning of my time in university, I was, I had my own beliefs, which were not the same as what was being taught, but I wasn't entirely confident in them. And in the following years, I became much more confident and entrenched in my own beliefs, but I was still willing to consider the other side, of course. I mean, I had to, like, for every single university assignment. But I remember maybe like my second year, I would speak up in class if we were talking about state redistribution, or if my tutor was touting on about how capitalism is the root of all evil. I would say something about this, and it would very swiftly be met with one, either silent disapproval, which is like glares from the class, or outright denial from the tutor, my professor, and often actually anger and disdain from my peers. I remember there was another time, maybe it was last year, I was taking some policy class, I think. This is going a bit off the Bitcoin track, but Bitcoin adjacent. I'm talking about government overreach and how that manifested during COVID in Australia, which I don't know if you were here during that time, but it was absolutely crazy, the powers that government had and what they inflicted on us as citizens. And we were talking about the government response during COVID in this policy class, and I decided to get up on my soapbox and proclaim how I thought it was absolutely deplorable, and it completely subverted any human freedoms that we should have, and it led to an indoctrination of a generation, and this flow-on effect that we now as a society accept these crazy government interventions in our personal life. And you should have seen it. It was me versus, I think, 15 or 20 people, and they hated me. They hated me for it. And it wasn't that we were just having a debate. It was, they thought that I was personally attacking them. And this because it is radicalization when you're not willing to hear the other side, this complete radicalization that is fostered in universities is something I think that may stand in the way of Gen Z Bitcoin adoption. And it's also something that is going to continue to influence our society and government policy, unfortunately for the worse, as we go on throughout the years. And, my peers, people who are studying law or studying policy, become law makers and policy makers, and then can actually inflict these now deeply held beliefs, these entrenched beliefs that university has thrust upon them into everyone's lives. So I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but obviously I'm quite passionate about this because it really infuriates me. And I think university is shaped by culture, but also university does shape culture. And unfortunately, there seems to be a real herd psychology, and people tend not to lift their head out of the sand unless they're absolutely forced to. Maybe we'll get to that point as inflation continues and gets worse and worse, to a point where you literally can't ignore it because you could afford your coffee yesterday and you can't today. Who knows? And then maybe people will be actually forced to consider alternate options. But as of right now, culture and this personality that's fostered in university of really like very far left Marxist thought, with no ear open to anything that even slightly disagrees with it, is very, very dangerous. And we also see this in escalating political violence, and the US is a perfect example of this. We are a little bit more fortunate in Australia. Well, fortunate and unfortunate, but a little bit more fortunate in Australia, where our population is not quite as divided as the US. But why I say that's also unfortunate is because I think it speaks to this louder narrative that we are all part of this herd psychology that has, again, been brought about and reinforced by higher education. What people are being indoctrinated with, and I use that word in all seriousness, I genuinely think university, in many cases, is indoctrination of very far left socialist and communist sort of thought. I do think this may stand in the way of Gen Z Bitcoin adoption, but I like to still have hope because I now see, especially in the online space, a lot of fellow Gen Zers coming out and beginning to question this narrative, or even in the comments of my videos, usually on TikTok, which is my more Gen Z base, people agreeing and people beginning to say, yes, I see what you're saying and I'm also not a fan of it. How do we change this? And that is possibly the doorway in to Gen Z.
Yep. And I can empathize with you massively there that you're sharing your thoughts and what you've seen with the world and ultimately what has changed your world for the better. And people just shut it down and call you crazy. And I'm the same. I've got friends, like close friends, that either don't talk to me anymore or message me saying you've lost your mind, when all I'm trying to do is help and make the world a better place by just pointing things out. Like, it's not even my opinion. It's just there's hard data here showing certain things, and people are indoctrinated, like you say, to just this right or wrong thinking and just being completely closed off to other ideas, which again links back to the phrase of everything you know about money is wrong, because if it was right, you'd already be rich. But people are so tied to their beliefs of what they've been taught. But if you follow maybe where those beliefs came from, and I like to always ask people to question for themselves, are they their own beliefs, or have those beliefs been put in their head by something or someone else? Because I think often with our generation, with things like inflation and it being so hard just to survive day to day, that there isn't any space for that free thinking, for that critical thinking of our generation. So they just accept whatever they've been told for the longest. Linking to that, you mentioned at the start you're leading the women-only female Bitcoin group in Sydney. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, how it's going, what your biggest lessons have been from that, and what your vision for the future is. Because I'm not sure if you've seen, but I'm starting an online community, Sovereign Kind, for our generation, Gen Zers. But like I said at the start, I think it's really important for female-only groups because, just as an example, my partner understands Bitcoin to an extent because that's all I talk about. But she isn't fully orange pilled, and she's also not very interested in learning anymore beyond what she knows because, in my opinion, there's not enough female voices. And whenever we've been on a journey together, whether it's business or fitness or finance, whatever you want to talk about, we'll be on the journey and then she'll lose interest if she can't find a female figure to have as her mentor or role model, because men and women are different people at the end of the day and they resonate better with different voices. So I think it's really cool, but I'd love you to go into a bit more detail around what you're doing, how it's going, and what the vision is for the future.
Yeah, of course. So Women in Bitcoin Sydney, as of right now, it's an event that I host monthly. Basically, we all get together at a coffee shop / bookshop in the daytime, which is different to the other Sydney events for Bitcoin, which tend to be at a pub in the evening. Super fun, but perhaps not the number one choice for women, especially women who want a softer launch into the Bitcoin space if they don't really know much about it to begin with. So we grab a coffee, breakfast, and then how it usually goes, well, it goes in one of two ways. So if I come to the event and it's a few long-time Bitcoiners, then I'll say, all right, let's just have a roundtable discussion about usually a topic that I've picked in advance. So last time was core and knots, and we had a long chat about that. And then also Bitcoin citadels, quite a few women are interested in talking about. However, that is rare that it's just, Bitcoiners. Usually it is complete newbies. And that's actually why I started the group, because I remember when I first begun in Bitcoin, going to the Bitcoin Sydney meets, which are absolutely fantastic, by the way. If you are ever in Sydney, you have to go. But especially as a young woman without a background in anything finance, it was quite intimidating because it is about 90% men. And I looked back on the beginning of my journey in Bitcoin, and I really do wish that there was a female-only space that was super friendly and open and made for beginners. There was a gap in the market. No one was doing it in Sydney when I started a few months ago, so I thought, why not? Like, I have time once a month, I may as well. And also it's really good for my own education. It keeps me on my toes and it makes sure that I'm up to date on everything. But yeah, that's really the gist of it. Come together for coffee, chat about Bitcoin. I'll go through a presentation if it's all newbies, and then we'll have a chat about it as well. And it's both surprised me and reinforced the ideas I already had about women entering Bitcoin. How it surprised me is not that many young women. Most women are in their 40s or 50s who attend, or even older. And I think why this is the case is, my theory why this is the case, is that these women perhaps have taken time off work to raise children and thus haven't been able to grow their capital, haven't put much money away into superannuation, and are now beginning to enter a period of their life where they actually need to think about that future where they again won't be working. And they're seeing, my goodness, like, things are not keeping up. I really, really need an alternative and something that's going to outpace everything around it. So they consider Bitcoin. I also think women later in life, or people later in life, perhaps are a little bit more open where there is that pressure. Whereas if there is no pressure, and maybe if you're a bit younger, you can be quite stuck in your ways, or not wanting to admit where perhaps you have gone wrong or you haven't explored all your options. So that's what really surprised me. And that's kind of my conceptualization of why the crowd seems to be a little bit older than myself and what I was expecting. But what has not surprised me is the reasons that women tell me they are interested in a women's only Bitcoin community. And that is, one, comfortability and ease of access. Like I said before, look, men are great, but as women walking into a room full of men where I might not have prior knowledge about the topic they're all discussing, it's very, very intimidating. No matter your age. I mean, me as a young woman, I did find it very intimidating. But clearly, with the slightly older cohort that come to my meetups, this is a sentiment that is shared across all age groups of women. So it's a really, really good soft entry point to the Bitcoin space. Also, another reason women like to seek out female-only spaces, or spaces that are tailored just toward women, is because you're completely correct with what you said before. Unlike, the government or mainstream media would like to suggest, men and women are actually very, very different. And we have different ways of viewing the world, and we have different priorities. Childbearing, or being at home with your kids and taking time off work, or having this mindset of, I'm really not a fan of where Australia is going for my children, so where are we going to move? A lot of women tend to be the decision makers when it comes to how children are raised, and this is something that's not touched on quite as much in the typical Bitcoin spaces, which are male and female, but obviously lean more male. So women, from what I've heard and from my personal experience, are really excited to be able to talk with like-minded women, who, mind you, in Sydney seem to be few and far between, about topics that are specific to women. And so that's what this space is. It's literally what it was made for. And I'm super excited to begin to start to dig deeper into that, like, female-specific content. As of right now, like I said before, like a few weeks ago, we talked about core and knots. That's not male or female specific. That's something else. But I am really, really looking forward to talking about, like, maybe how motherhood looks as a Bitcoiner, or how raising your kids on a Bitcoin standard looks, or how you can use Bitcoin as a savings account when you're not working, or when you're working very little while you might have kids. I think these are things that are yet to be touched on in depth in the wider space, and it's something that both myself and the ladies who have come to the group are really, really excited to explore together. Finally, like, another great thing about this group is, of course, the social aspect. So as a female Bitcoiner, or as like a freedom-minded woman, finding friends who agree with me is so difficult, if not near impossible. Maybe it's just because, our generation is swept up in the madness of what's going on in the world and has just been totally indoctrinated. Or maybe I'm, not looking hard enough. But it has been very difficult to find like what. So I'm really happy to have started this community, not only so I can speak to more women who think similarly to me, but because I know they have the exact same experience and they've expressed to me they have the exact same experience as me. And it is really quite a liberating process to be able to sit down in a circle of ladies and speak freely and not be, labeled as crazy or a conspiracy theorist, but actually be heard. Because take it from me, it doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often where someone is going to be operating on a similar wavelength and we're able to have a constructive discussion over hours. So this is really refreshing. And those are the main reasons why I started Women in Bitcoin Sydney. It's been really well received so far. The rest of the community, the Sydney community, has been pretty ecstatic about it. And online, people have been sharing, they've been liking. So it's been really great. And honestly, it's been quite heartwarming to see this reaction. The only thing I would say or the only criticism I would say that I have encountered is some people questioning, like, why do you even need a female-only space? It's not like we bar you from, and by we I mean men, it's not like men bar you from accessing normal Bitcoin spaces. Like, this just seems like a bit of a cope or a bit of a feminist cope. It's not that. It's exactly what I covered before. Men and women are very, very different. It's great that we have these like commingling spaces, but women's voices talking about what a lot of women want to hear about in Bitcoin are massively underrepresented in the Bitcoin space because there aren't that many women who are interested in it. The Bitcoin space is actually super open to women and women's voices, and the amount of support that I've received has been crazy. It's just, as of right now, I think there is this perception from women that it's maybe not so accessible of a space because it is so male dominated, but it couldn't be further from the truth. And I do think that's why having this women's only space can act as a soft launch into the wider community and can get more women involved overall.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Funnel people from no idea and potentially scared to freedom fundamentally, because they can ease their way in a space that they feel comfortable and then go and commingle with the main group. Men and women are completely different beings, emotionally, hormonally, everything. And I think what you're doing is amazing. And I can empathize again. And it does get lonely sometimes because you almost sometimes question yourself whether you are going crazy, because there's so few people that see and understand the world the way that you see it, which is why I think if used correctly, social media can be extremely powerful when you find those people, and you're doing that online, but also in person, which is amazing. Because I think as we become more and more connected through social media, people are actually craving more and more that in-person connection because they've never felt as disconnected as they do now. For anyone that's listening today and something's clicking or something's making sense that makes them want to look more into the problem or into Bitcoin to start that journey, what would one piece of advice or one piece of content or one book that you'd first recommend to someone just getting ready to take a look?
It is difficult to choose, but my initiation into Bitcoin was with Robert Breedlove's What is Money podcast, and it is still one of my favorite Bitcoin podcasts. It's super digestible. He covers 1,000,001 different topics. So if you want to come at Bitcoin from a political angle or a cultural angle or a finance angle, a spiritual angle even, he's got you. So I would really encourage people to go check out the What is Money show. And also I have just finished reading Lawrence Lepard's The Big Print. Fantastic. I've read a handful of Bitcoin books, and I've also read a lot of more Austrian economics books, like Hayek, for example, or Mises. And those are very, very heavy. And that's actually quite a difficult place to start. But The Big Print was fantastic. It was such an easy read. It took me, I'm quite a slow reader actually, but it took me maybe a week to finish it. And it was really entertaining from start to finish. I was deeply enthralled in everything that Lawrence Lepard had to say. And he also includes graphs, visuals, which are really, really good at helping the reader grasp what he's actually talking about. So, I mean, maybe that's a bit of recency bias from me, but I would really recommend the big print in conjunction with the What is Money show to really formulate a deeper understanding about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I'll put the links for both of those in the description below as well, along with your socials. I'll second that as well. The Big Print by Lawrence Lepard is a fantastic book that really lays out the problem, the solution, what the world is going to look like with statistics and data to back it up. But most importantly, it's really digestible. I found it one of the most digestible Bitcoin books that I've read. And it's one of my go-to. If someone's interested, I'll say, read this book first and then we'll start talking, because it really helps understand. And I think if people watch What's the Problem by Joe, I don't know if you've seen that video yet, and then coupled that with The Big Print by Lawrence Lepard, I don't think there's going to be many people that aren't at least interested to start looking into Bitcoin further. So they're my two go-tos. I'm mindful of the time. Is there any last things you'd like to touch on, or anything that you'd like to close out with?
For me, I think we've covered a lot. Honestly, I could talk for Africa on any of these topics that we have covered, but I think we will maybe leave it here for now. I've really enjoyed my time chatting to you about Gen Z, Bitcoin, the indoctrination of our generation, and there is so much more to cover, but I think we would need possibly many days to do that. So I think best left here for now.
Elle, thanks very much for jumping on, and everyone, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.